Hey gang, Vespa here. As Chapter 9 wraps up, it's really important that we understand how to read these problems and pick out what parameter is being referenced. For many folks, the course from this point on becomes a course in critical reading, right? So you're going to learn similar procedures for several different parameters each chapter. And so we understand here as we read this problem in a trial of 250 patients who received a 10 milligram dose of a drug daily, 35 reported headache as a side effect. What they've done is they've told me a sample size and then referenced some portion of that sample that possessed a given characteristic. And understand that that's referencing a proportion, right? So we're going to estimate P, or the population proportion. And then that's, of course, reinforced by them referencing P hat down here, which is the sample proportion. But it's important we read this and be able to pick out, oh, we're talking about a proportion. And once I know I'm talking about a proportion, if I wanted to say a confidence interval, I'm going to go stat, and that's proportion stats. So far, we've only done one sample stuff. We won't do two sample stuff until chapter 11. But so we go one sample, and then typically we'll do a summary with proportions. So X is your number of successes, N is the number of observations, and then we've done confidence intervals so far. Eventually, we'll do hypothesis tests as well. Okay? But that's how we get our confidence intervals for P. If I needed just the z-scores, if I needed critical values, I'd go calculators, and proportions are normally distributed, so we're still using the normal calculator here. If I take a look at a problem like this, it gives me data for the length of the growing season, okay? And we're talking about estimating the mean length of the growing season. Now, in this particular case, it very obviously says mean, right? We're talking about the mean. So I'm going to estimate mu, in which case we're talking about the student t distribution. So I need to be able to read this problem and understand it's asking me to estimate a mean, a population mean, right? And then down here, they even state it, right? Construct a 95% confidence interval for the mean length of the growing season. So I have to be able to pick that out and then know what to do with that. So if I want a confidence interval for a mean, I'm going stat. And because samples for the mean follow the t distribution, we're going t-stats. And we're working with one sample data right now. So in that problem, we had data. So we would go with data. We would have imported it in. But every once in a while, you'll go from a summary. But again, we need to be able to pick out that we're discussing the mean in this case. That's the parameter under question. The final parameter that we discussed that we're working on estimating is the standard deviation. And again, these things typically jump out at us if we read carefully, but it's important come quiz time and test time when I don't necessarily know I'm working on a problem from 9.3 that as I read here, it asks me to construct a 99% confidence interval for the population standard deviation. So we're trying to estimate sigma. I need to be able to pick that out so that when I import my data into StatCrunch, I understand that the process for this confidence interval is different than for a proportion or a mean because the standard deviation, right, the sampling distribution for the standard deviation follows a different distribution. So if I want to do a confidence interval, I come down to variance stats because standard deviation is related to variance. Remember, this is going to give me a confidence interval for the variance, so I have to take the square root of those values. If I'm getting critical values, sampling distribution for the standard deviation follows the chi-squared distribution, so I can get critical values by pulling up the chi-squared calculator. But it's important we be able to read problems and pick out the parameter under question and then know what process to follow in order to get the confidence interval, or in Chapter 10, we're going to learn about hypothesis tests. So please focus on that critical reading aspect as you're finishing up and quizzing on Chapter 9.